Chapter 7. The Antisocial and the Social. In the days after the party, Brian thought he noticed some changes around the office. Just a few little things here and there that made him pause and think. He wasn't sure whether he was just imagining these things. For example, each day when he opened the fridge to collect his lunch, was it just Brian's imagination? Or was his lunchbox always on its own in a corner while the rest of the fridge was full? Was he also imagining the looks in his direction when workmates were chatting nearby? And there was the time when he was introduced to someone who just smiled when Brian went to shake his hand. One day, Brian experienced something that was definitely not just in his imagination. On one of Brian's visits to the washroom, after he had walked out of one toilet cubicle, he saw a worker standing by the next cubicle. The man was reading something on his phone and seemed to be waiting for a free toilet cubicle. "This one's free," Brian said to the man, pointing at the toilet cubicle he had just come out of. "That's fine. I'll wait," said the man without looking up. He continued to look at his phone. Brian walked past the man towards the sinks, making sure he kept his body between his hands and the man. Careful, thought Brian. Can't let him see. As he washed his hands, he watched as small bits of skin peeled off and floated down the sinkhole. His hands began to lose their color. Brian was prepared for this and always carried a tanning, moisturizing cream in his back pocket. This helped manage the dryness and add some color back. He dried his hands and applied the cream, all the time with his back to the man. As he opened the door to leave, he heard a voice call out from behind him. "Zombie scum." Brian left the room and walked back to his desk. He tried to get on with his work, but found his mind going back to what the man said. He kept hearing those two words over and over in his head. Zombie scum. The next day, Brian told Steve about the guy in the washroom. Brian and Steve had become friends over the past few weeks, and Brian felt comfortable enough to speak to him about his personal life. "That's terrible, Brian," said Steve with a sorry look on his face. "Try and forget about it, mate. Those kind of people, they're not worth thinking about." "News travels fast, I guess," said Brian, thinking back to the night of the staff party. Steve paused for a moment before looking up at Brian. "Speaking of news, have you checked the staff notice board recently?" Steve asked. "No, not lately," Brian responded. "Well, there's this one notice about an undead-friendly event happening soon. I didn't have time to read it properly. Why don't you check it out?" On his way back to his desk, Brian checked the notice board. There, in the corner, was a sheet of paper with a headline written in big letters. "Undead-friendly social night this Friday." Below the headline, there was an image of the sun rising from behind mountains. Yellow rays of sunlight were shining in all directions. Brian read on. "Undead? Living? Join workmates for food, drinks, and fun at the Sunrise Bar. All are welcome. Just bring a warm smile. BIO food drinks for dietary requirements. 6 p.m., Friday the 6th of May. The Sunrise Bar, West Street. BIO. Brian wondered. Oh, right, he thought. Bring your own. That Friday, Brian received a message from Susie on his phone. "So, meet you at 6 downstairs?" Brian wrote back, confused. "Why, what's happening?" A few seconds later, he received another message. "Undead-friendly event at Sunrise Bar. You're coming with me and Steve, right? Just say yes." Brian didn't know what to say at times like this. Susie was always so positive about, Well, everything. Just say yes. That was easy for her to say. She wasn't undead. She hadn't gone through what Brian had. She didn't have to deal with people avoiding her, giving her funny looks or saying nasty things. Same thing with Steve. What had Steve gone through that was anything like this? What if Brian was the only zombie there? What if the bar was full of haters? He might have to take more abuse from people. There could be a fight. Brian started to think of reasons not to go to the event. Perhaps he could say he was sick. Or perhaps he already had plans. He could have plans. You never have plans, Brian, he thought. Just say yes, shouted Susie's voice in his head, breaking through his thoughts. Brian reached for his phone and started typing. Sure, see you downstairs at 6. Then he hit the send button. Chapter 8. The Sunrise. The bar was just a 10-minute walk away. When Brian, Steve, and Susie reached the building, they looked up to see a bright yellow sun on a red signboard. The sun's rays spread out and off the edge of the signboard. Next to the sun were the words, "The Sunrise Bar." The sound of live music was coming from inside. Steve held the door open for Susie and Brian. They walked in to see a bar straight ahead of them. A barmaid was cleaning glasses and placing them on shelves, while a barman was taking someone's order. To the left were several long wooden tables with benches to sit on. A group of 5 people were sitting at one of these tables playing a dice game. To the right were several smaller tables with wooden chairs. A couple was sitting at one table and a group of 3 at another. Behind them, on the far right wall, was a stage where a woman in her 20s was playing the guitar and singing. "Here for the social?" called a woman from one of the long tables on the left. "Yes, that's right," said Susie, walking over. Brian followed. As they got closer to the table, they could see the 5 people more clearly. A tall man and woman were sitting at the far side of the table, facing them. On the near side were 3 more people. Well, I say people. I mean, there were 2 people and a shirt, a tie, and trousers floating in the air. Brian had heard about ghosts before, but he'd never actually met one. "Linda!" said Steve loudly as he entered behind the other 2. "I didn't know you were coming." "Hey, Steve, me neither," she replied. "It was actually my Bill who asked me to join. Bill and his workmates arranged the event." Bill was sitting immediately beside her. "So this is the Bill then? Finally we get to meet. I'm Steve. I work with Linda," said Steve, shaking Bill's hand. "And this is Brian from HR and Susie from marketing." "Steve, Susie, and Brian," said Bill. "Great to meet you guys," Bill continued, shaking Susie's and Brian's hands. "I'm Bill, and this is my wife, Linda. And this is Arnold, Lisa, and Julie. They all work with me in IT. The group put their dice game to one side and made room for the 3 newcomers to join their table. "Drinks, anyone? Food?" asked Linda. Brian's stomach made a sound of complaint. "You'll eat, Brian, won't you?" said Susie. She brought a hand towards her mouth and spoke to the group in a pretend whisper. "He was so nervous he forgot to eat his lunch. He's brought lunch and dinner with him." "Susie," Brian complained. "Don't worry, Brian, we're all friends here," said Linda, pulling something from a plastic bag. "We're really glad you all came along. We've been wanting to do something like this for ages." Linda placed 3 bottles on the table. Each bottle was full of thick red liquid. "There's more where that came from if anyone wants a try," said Bill, smiling. Nobody said anything. "What? It's not human blood," said Bill, looking hurt. Vampires. Brian used to know a vampire a long time ago, but they lost contact. I wonder what Victor's up to these days. And did you bring anything, Brian? Said a male voice coming from the floating shirt. All the heads at the table turned to look in Brian's direction. The shirt and tie seemed to move up and down with laughter. You all know already, don't you? Said Brian with a laugh before pulling his lunchbox out of his bag and placing it in front of him. Fresh cow brains, come and get them, said Brian. As the evening went on, several more people joined their group until there were around 20 in total. Of these, 8 were undead, 3 vampires, Bill, Linda, and Jeffrey, 1 ghost, Arnold, 4 zombies, Brian, Mark, Sally, and Nadia. Oh, I'm starving, said Nadia as she arrived at the table with her boyfriend, Gary. I'd absolutely kill for some brains, she added. The living humans at the table gave her a nervous look. No, I meant, said Nadia. I just meant that I'm hungry. Not that. There was laughter all around, and Susie reminded Brian that he had another meal in his bag. Here, you can have this, said Brian, handing Nadia his other food box. Are you sure? Asked Nadia. Wow, thanks. A few seconds passed. This is amazing, Brian, said Nadia, speaking with her mouth full of food. Seriously, guys, you just have to try this, she added, holding her fork out towards Mark and Sally, the other 2 zombies at the table. She's right, agreed Mark as he chewed on a long piece of pig brain. He passed the fork to Sally. Wow, this is much better than the stuff I'm used to, said Sally. It's just so fresh and juicy. Where on earth do they come from? Oh, I get them from some friends of mine who own a farm, Brian replied. It's all I eat, really. They're absolutely delicious, said Nadia as a piece of brain fat dropped onto her blouse. I'm serious, she added, licking the last few bits off the lid of the box. I would pay for brains as good as these. The event was a complete success, and the group continued to chat and laugh all through the night and into the early hours. Barry the barman, it turns out, was a vampire, and joined the group after the normal closing time when most people had already left. Brian, Steve, and Susie were the last few people to leave the bar. By the time they left, it was already getting lighter outside. As Brian walked out through the doors, he was greeted with an amazing bright red sunrise. Chapter 9, A Working Lunch. Over the next few weeks, Brian began to order more brains on his weekly trips to the farm outside town. At home, he divided the brains into single meal sizes. He labeled each meal chicken, duck, pig, or sheep, and stored them in his freezer. From Monday to Friday each week, Brian took orders from his new zombie friends, Mark, Sally, and Nadia. On Friday, he took the meals into work and delivered them to those who had ordered earlier in the week. The next week, the process started again. Brian's 3 zombie friends were very thankful. As working zombies, they didn't have much time to hunt for their own food, so they used to buy bags of brains from underground zombies. But these brains usually came from sewer rats, lizards, and who knows what else, all minced together in a bag. They were not particularly tasty, and their freshness was questionable. During this time, Brian began to experiment with the flavor of his brains. Each week, he added a different herb or spice to the mix. The following week, he would ask what Mark, Sally, and Nadia thought about the new taste. He listened to their opinions and used this information to improve the recipe. News of Brian's fresh, tasty brains spread quickly. He began receiving more and more orders from zombies across the company. Soon, he was receiving more orders than he could manage and needed to create a waiting list for new customers. Brian realized he needed help. One day he met up with Steve and Susie for lunch. He explained the situation to them. "Oh my gosh, Brian, that's incredible," said Susie. "You really have been busy these past few weeks." "I know," said Brain. "It's just all happening so fast. All I wanted to do at the beginning was help out a few friends. Now I can't keep up with all the orders." "You've certainly found a gap in the market," said Steve. "You could create a business out of this." "A business?" said Brian, scratching his head. "I wouldn't know where to start." There was a short pause. Susie took a sip from her glass of water, and Steve had a bite from his sandwich. "But you already have started, Brian," said Susie, "and you're doing a really good job of it." "What do you mean?" asked Brian. "She's right," added Steve. "Look, you've found yourself a good supplier for your product." "Yeah, but that's just a farm I used to work at," said Brian. "Exactly," said Steve. "You managed to find a supplier from your network of contacts. Not everyone has those kinds of contacts, Bri. And look at what you've been doing recently," Susie said. "You've been getting feedback from your customers and using that feedback to improve the product. That's called customer research." "I just wanted to improve the recipe, that's all," said Brian. "If you already have more orders than you can manage," Susie went on, "then that's a great sign that there's a real future in this." Susie continued, looking into the air and drawing imaginary pictures as she spoke. "Don't settle for sewer rats. Take your pick from our selection of free-range brains," she said powerfully. "Free-range, huh?" thought Brain. "Well, it is a free-range farm. The animals can walk around freely outdoors." "Fresh from the farm. Ordered to your office," Susie continued. "I think I'm going to need more people to help manage these deliveries," said Brian. He continued, "But I don't have any more space in my freezer." "What you really need is a building for storage and distribution," said Steve. "Storage and distribution?" asked Brian. "Right," Steve continued. "You'll need a kind of warehouse to store and freeze the food. And if this warehouse is nearer the city, you'll be able to make faster deliveries." "Fresh from the farm, delivered to your door," Susie added. Brian thought for a moment. "I like the idea. I mean, the farm is pretty far away. It would be more efficient to order more product, store it in a warehouse, then deliver directly to customers." There was another pause while Brian took a bite of his cow brains. Suddenly, he put down his fork and looked up. "I'd need someone to manage the marketing side of things," he said, looking in Susie's direction. "And I'd need someone to find a suitable property," he continued, looking towards Steve. "Someone with the experience and knowledge to pick the right location around the city." Brian continued, "But to start with, we'll need some time to get more customers and get a bit more money coming in." "We," said Susie and Steve at the same time. "Right. We'll need to use both your freezers as well as mine," Brian went on, "and we'll need all three of us to help make deliveries around the office." There was another pause as Susie and Steve looked at each other with eyebrows raised. Chapter 10. Brian's Brains. Over the next few months, Brian, Steve, and Susie all helped to collect orders and deliver food outside their regular jobs. It wasn't long before they again were receiving more orders than they could manage. Their freezers were already full of brains, and they found themselves busy all the time. Brian was the first to leave his job, feeling that he needed to give all his time to the project to help it succeed. Susie and Steve followed shortly after. They put together a business plan, took out a bank loan, and registered their business. When it came to choosing a name for the business, the three co-founders didn't take long to decide. Brian's Brains. The three began working from a small office in the center of town. Brian managed purchasing and product development. He was able to get a good deal with the farm he used to work at on the purchase of fresh animal brains. He also continued doing his customer research, slowly improving the flavor and style until it matched his zombie customers' tastes. Eventually, he created 4 different flavors that he was confident would delight customers: cockroach chicken, dragonfly duck, pistachio pig, and Chardonnay sheep. Steve dealt with operations and property. He managed to find a suitable warehouse on the edge of town and hired a number of large freezers, which could be used to store much larger quantities of brains. He organized a delivery contract between the farm and the warehouse, and used a delivery app to manage orders and deliveries from the warehouse to customers. Susie was responsible for marketing and sales. She set up a website that showed all the products available at Brian's Brains and allowed customers to place orders. She managed the relationship with the customers, giving them the latest news and showing them how to place orders through the website or delivery app. At the same time, undead-friendly events were becoming more popular around town. The 3 co-founders went to many of these events. They developed relationships with the organizers and were often allowed to give free brain samples to zombies. Many of these zombies became new customers. Brains became more and more popular with zombies throughout the town, and sales grew stronger and stronger. One Friday evening, Brian, Steve, and Susie decided to go back to the Sunrise Bar. They had heard that there was now an undead-friendly event every week. As they walked towards the door, the sound of rock music grew louder and louder. They entered the bar. Barry the barman gave them a friendly wave over a crowd of customers. To the right, a large group of people stood listening to a band playing on stage. The tables had all been cleared away. "Look, Brian, it's an undead band," said Susie excitedly. "Wow, there's something you don't see every day," added Steve. Brian looked up towards the stage where he could see 4 performers. They were clearly undead. In fact, they didn't seem to be hiding their natural look at all. The singer was a tall man with a pale face and red eyes. He was wearing black jeans and a black shirt and held the microphone with 2 bony hands. His long, pointed teeth could be seen every time he opened his mouth to sing. Standing next to him was a tall lady playing a bass guitar and dressed in red and black. "2 vampires! It's Bill and Linda," cried Susie. Brian had to take another look. It was difficult to tell without the makeup. "Oh my gosh, it really is them," said Brian. Next to Bill and Linda, there was a guitar floating in the air and rocking to the music. Immediately behind the guitar was a shirt, tie, and trousers floating in the air and rocking with the guitar. A ghost. At the back of the stage were the drums. A pale face looked out from behind them. A female face with large, dark circles around the eyes, colorless lips, and loose skin that seemed to peel off her face and arms. A pale pair of hands sent the drumsticks crashing down in time with the music. A zombie! For a second, Brian felt he recognized the face, but he couldn't seem to remember where he had seen it. After ordering drinks, Brian, Steve, and Susie bumped into some old workmates and enjoyed catching up on old times. "Guys, it's just been amazing," shouted Nadia over the music. "The event has just got bigger and bigger." "That guitarist, is that Arnold?" asked Susie. "That's right," Nadia replied. Bill, Linda, and Arnold had been talking about starting a band for ages. "They're just fantastic, aren't they?" "They're awesome," agreed Brian. "And do you know who the drummer is?" As Nadia started to answer, the band finished their last song. People began to move past them and towards the bar. The group moved to a table near the stage and were soon joined by members of the band. "Long time no see," called Linda. "You never told us you were in a band," said Steve. As the group continued to greet each other, Brian felt a light tap on his shoulder from something wooden. "Fancy seeing you here, Brian," said a familiar voice. He turned around to see a pair of pale hands holding drumsticks. Looking up, he saw a pair of colorless lips smiling at him. The smile seemed to spread from the lips to the cheeks, to two large blue eyes with dark circles around them. He recognized that smile. "Rachel," said Brian. "Surprised to see me," said the receptionist. "Just a bit," replied Brian. "I started coming to the Sunrise around a month ago and met the guys," said Rachel, taking a seat beside Brian and Linda. "Linda said they were looking for a drummer, so here I am." "And no makeup. That was pretty brave," said Brian. "Yeah," Rachel replied. "Linda said from the start that they didn't want to hide on stage, and it just felt like the right time." Brian continued, "You know, I think I was so worried about other people finding out about me that I never stopped to think there might be other zombies working with me too. How's everything going at work, by the way?" Same old, said Rachel. "To be honest, the only time I feel truly alive is when I'm here at the Sunrise." "I know the feeling," said Brian. "I asked management about the dress code at work, but they weren't very open to making changes," said Rachel, looking down at the skin peeling from her hands. "They said the undead look was too unprofessional," she added. "You know, we've been looking for a receptionist at Brian's Brains," said Brian. "And there's no dress code." A word from Brian. "Thank you for taking the time to read about my life. It's been a great adventure, that's for sure. But now's just the start, really. Brian's Brains is going to take a lot of hard work and energy, but I hope we can make it a success. I'd love to hear what you thought of my story. I've set up a web page where you can write something for me if you like. thelanguageprofessional.com/Brian, I respond to every comment, you know." "Oh, and Steve, Susie, and Rachel asked me to say hi. Cheers, Brian."